Today, we're going to be going over a great wide receiver football IQ quiz to test your knowledge of the position. So if you're not familiar with our quiz style videos, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a pre-snap look like this one on the screen right here, ask you a series of questions about the look, give you a chance to pause the video, think about your answer, give an answer, and then I'm going to break down why your answer was right, wrong, and what's the correct way to go about the specific question I ask. So first question we're going to be asking here is how would you guys run a 10 to 12 yard dig route versus this specific coverage? So how would you guys run a 10 to 12 yard dig versus this specific coverage? You guys can go ahead and pause the video and think about your answers. So pause the video. All right, let's break this thing down. So first things first here, when we're coming up to the line of scrimmage and we have to come up with a plan on my route, right? I know that I have to run a 10 to 12 yard dig. When it comes to coming up with a plan off the line in terms of my release, how I'm going to structure the route, we're looking for two specific things. First one is going to be the DB's leverage. So is he inside leverage like he is in this example? Is he head up or is he outside leverage? Because that determines what type of release I'm going to take and the release that I am going to choose in terms of my footwork. Now, the second thing I want to look for is the distance between me and the DB. Is he right up on the line of scrimmage? Is he maybe 2 yards away? Is he 5 yards away? Is he an off man coverage? Because all of those factor into how I would run the route. So when we see this look, we see inside shade. A good way to tell it it's inside shade is you look at the midline of a DB, and if that midline is even with our front foot, that means he's inside shade. If his midline is even with my midline, that means he's head up. If his midline is even with my back foot, that means he's outside leverage. So that's what we're looking for. Now, he's maybe about, like I would say, a yard, yard and a half away. So if I have to run a 10 to 12 yard dig route, and you said that you would want to close the distance with him and then attack his leverage, give him some kind of fake to the inside, then take an outside release, that would be correct. Now, this receiver does that. It's the right idea. He's trying to do the right things, but he runs this route incorrectly, guys, because as a receiver, it's more than just knowing what to do. You have to know what to do and then have the technique to execute it. So we're going to show a positive example of what he's trying to do in a second here from Zay Flowers, but let's talk about why this is wrong, but why it's the right concept. So he comes off the ball, he attacks him inside, takes an outside release. That's exactly how you would draw it up, but he gets locked up on this thing. This DB's able to stay on his inside hip, gets a pick. So why is this thing not correct? So let's talk about it. So he does everything right, like we said. He closes the space with the DB, attacks his leverage to the inside. He gets that DB to take that leverage step and hold his leverage. Perfect. That's exactly what we want to do. Guys, when we have a DB who's lined up inside shade, we're not going to be able to take an inside release, even when I have to run an inside breaking route. This DB is disciplined, right? His whole goal being inside leverage is don't give up the inside release. So he's going to be disciplined. He's going to get hands. And if I end up running this dig all the way on the other side or the opposite hash, that's not a good route. That's not an impressive route. And it doesn't keep spacing any real game scenarios. So we have to get comfortable taking what he gives us. Now, the cardinal mistake that this wide receiver makes, he attacks his leverage, he does well, but he does not get skinny. He goes too wide. It's almost like he is trying to avoid hand contact from this DB in this situation. Because, guys, when we take an outside release versus inside shade press, it's not the most easy situation, but my goal should always be to stack the DB. I want this DB trailing my back hip, if you guys don't know what stacking means or restacking means. So when I get to the top of the break, I give him a fake move to the outside, then cut in, or vice versa if I have an outside breaking route. Or I want to get skinny to the DB. Maybe not to stack him, but so he can be right on my hip. Because when he is hip to hip with me, it makes this move that this receiver tries to do at the top, which is called a throw-by move, where you slip under the DB. That's what I recommend doing if you're not able to stack him. But because there's too much space between the two of them and there's this big gap, that DB, when he tries to drop his hips, he is not able to throw by with his inside hand. He can't put that inside hand on the back of this DB's shoulder, back of this DB's hip to throw him by so he could slip underneath and get separation. Because I could try to keep spacing all day long, but if I can't get separation because my technique is off or the stem of the route is off, that's when this DB is going to be able to make a play and we're going to end up almost running into him on that throw-by fake. So let's play this full speed one more time, and then we'll break down a correct example of that throw-by move. So again, he takes this outside release, but he's not tight enough, guys. Every single time we take an outside release with an inside shade press guy, let's get hip to hip with him. Let's attack that outside hand and let's try to run as tight as we can to him so I could either throw by or stack him. So now let's look at this clip here from Zay Flowers, okay? So he actually runs the opposite. He runs a 10-yard out with an inside release, but he uses the same throw by concept at the top of the route. It's honestly the exact same thing, guys. It's just a flipped route, but we're trying to focus on his throw by move, okay? Now, before we get into this throw by move and we break it down, fellas, if you're a receiver and you would like to train with myself and my staff of coaches this this offseason, we are going to be coming out to 11 more states across the country for 2-day long QB and wide receiver training camp. So check out that very first link in the description below if you guys are interested. Every single camp on the left side over here, our next camp is going to be in Portland, then we're going to Dallas, Nashville, Chicago. All those are completely sold out, but we have available spots in Buffalo, Atlanta, Houston, Philly, Detroit, Boise, and Los Angeles. If you guys are local to any one of those cities, fellas, we'd absolutely love to have you out. It's a 2-day long training camp for quarterbacks and wide receivers. I myself will be there and my staff. So check out that very first link in the description below. We'd love to get you out there, you guys. Again, very first link below. Let's get back to this video. So now let's talk about the correct way to do this throw-by move. So it's really the same concept. Remember, we have an inside shade press guy, and I have to run a dig route with an outside release. If he is right next to me, I want to slip under him and use a throw-by move. So if I have to run a 10-yard out, which is the opposite of a dig, and I have an outside shade press guy who doesn't let me stack him and he's right next to me, I still use that throw-by move. But I want you to pay attention to how close he runs to this DB. So let's talk about it. So he is right next to the DB, hip to hip with him. So at the break point, he could actually use his hand and be able to swat him by. Guys, if he would have done this release, like let's say, for example, he does this move, but he's avoiding the contact. He doesn't want to get hands. Guys, as a receiver, we should welcome the contact because the contact makes it easier for me to either stack or it makes it easier for me to use this throw-by move like we were talking about, right? So when he's pushing up into this stem, he's not running away from him. He is getting hip to hip with him. I call that getting skinny because, guys, think about it like this. You could get skinny in any situation because if you get skinny, let's say you're faster than the guy, it makes it easier for you to stack him, right? Whether you have an inside breaking route or an outside breaking route. If you get skinny and you're running hip to hip with him, and let's say you have to run an outside breaking route, it makes it easier for you to put this hand on the back of his hip, back of his shoulder, and swat him by. They call it a throw-by move. But now think about it. Getting skinny is also beneficial on an inside breaking route. Let's say it's a post route and you got that inside release. What can you do because you're hip to hip with him? You could lean into him. I call it a chicken wing move, where you lean into him and almost push off of him without getting flagged for it. You see guys like Travis Kelce, bigger wide receivers, use this type of thing all the time. So let's play this thing full speed one more time. So guys, remember, anytime that we release opposite of a DB's leverage, let's run as tight as we can to him, okay? So now, next question here, next look, I guess you could say pre-snap, is how would you guys run a 12 back to 10-yard curl versus this specific coverage? So how would you guys run a 12 back to 10-yard curl versus this specific coverage? So you guys can go ahead and pause the video and think about your answers. So pause the video. All right, let's break this thing down. So if you guys said that you would attack this DB's leverage to the inside, take an outside release, then break it right off, that would be 100% correct. Now, the thing about a curl route, right, when you're running a curl or when you're running a comeback, what do you have to do after you break down, after you drop your hips? You got to be able to come back to the ball, right? And so if you guys run this curl, and you also have to, again, drop your hips at the break point. So if you guys said you would attack him inside, outside release, and you would try to stack, that would actually be wrong. I would prefer on a 10 to 12-yard curl that you try the best you can to keep this DB right next to your hip, because it's hard to run a curl route where you got to drop your hips when a DB's directly behind you, because it's just going to run into you. So I recommend getting skinny, staying tight to him, but we still want to take the outside release and attack him off the ball. Just make sure that we don't stack, right? Because remember, this DB is lined up what? He's lined up inside leverage. So on a curl route, ideally, I would love an inside release because I could just turn, ball could be right there. But if this DB's lined up inside leverage, it's very, very similar to that dig that we were talking about. He's not going to give up the inside. He's not going to let me just take this inside release and run away from him. He's going to hold this leverage. He's going to be disciplined. If we force it, my curl gets rerouted way inside, I'm off the platform of the route. Now, this receiver ultimately runs it incorrectly, and we're obviously going to show a positive example in a second, but I'm going to play it full speed, then we'll break it down. So he comes off the ball, outside release, but his hip drop is very, very slow, you guys. So the issue is that, guys, when we have a DB who is in press coverage, right? Like I said, we could do all the little things right in terms of how I run the route. I could attack him inside and I could take this outside release, but that's why the receiver position is more than just mental, but it's also more than just physical. You need a combination of both. So when he takes this outside release to the outside, he attacks him, works outside, but you see at the break point, you see how it's a slow sink of his hips, right? It's not a violent drop of his hips. Guys, a disciplined DB, when he is in press coverage, this DB's eyes are ultimately a little bit high. A more disciplined DB is going to be watching our hips. So the faster I could drop my hips, the more time I'm going to have to create, or the less time the DB is going to have to react, more time I'm going to have to create separation. But the slower I drop my hips, I have this sink of the hips, I take all these steps at the break point. It's not a fast hip drop. That just gives this guy more time. He could read my body language. As soon as he sees those hips drop, he is putting the brakes on as well. So let's play at full speed. So again, guys, we need a fast hip drop. It is not a sink of the hips. It is a violent drop of the hips. So let's look at this example of this wide receiver right here. Running a curl route. He's got an inside shade press guy, so he took the outside release like we were talking about. He doesn't have him stacked. We never want to stack when I have to run a curl or a comeback. We want to try to keep him as close as I can on my inside or outside hip, depending on the route. So he's pushing up, but look how quick he throttles down, how violent he is with the drop of his weight. Guys, there's a phrase that I'll tell my wide receivers to help them at the top of the break be a little bit more violent. It's two things. I'll say pretend there is a string attached to your chin, and when it's time to break, somebody pulls that string as quickly as you can. Second thing I say is try to tie your shoes with your hand as fast as you can. So you want to drop down and tie your shoes and do it as quickly as possible. Because guys, the more violent and the more aggressive that hip drop is, you're still getting to the same low position, but the faster you could get there gives that DB less time to react. So anytime that I'm running just a simple hitch, this could be against off coverage, anytime I'm running a curl, anytime I'm running a dig where I maybe have to do a throw by and slip under a guy, that break point has to be violent. Pretend there is a string attached to that chin and somebody's pulling that string straight down. So let's play this again, full speed one more time. Great job by that receiver throttling down, having that violent drop of his hips to be able to get separation. Okay, so now, this next example here, obviously, as you can see, because I played the clip a little bit, this wide receiver gets jammed off the ball. So I'm going to play this thing full speed first, and then I'm going to ask you a series of questions about this specific look. But let me play this full speed, and then we'll talk about it. So the question I want to ask you guys with this look is, why do you think this DB got jammed off the ball, right? Now, granted, listen, it's one-on-ones. I get it. This DB obviously knows the snap count. We're not going to be doing a hard count. There's no threat of the run, but there's a couple things mechanically that this wide receiver could clean up that I want to ask you guys about. So you guys can go ahead and pause the video and kind of think about your answer for a sec. But why do you think this wide receiver got jammed off the ball? What are some things that he could do better in this situation? So why do you think this wide receiver got jammed off the ball? So you guys go ahead and pause the video and think about your answer. So pause the video. All right, let's break this thing down. So there's two key areas that I'm really honestly looking at here that kind of screwed this wide receiver in the first place, right? Number one is that his hands are down by his knees, right? Now, I'm not that guy that's going to say that you need to have your hands up by your chest and be like super tense and like almost like flex your traps at the top of this movement. I'm not going to say that because I actually don't want that. You don't want to be too tense, but you also don't want to be too relaxed where your hands are below your knees. I would like your hands to be probably like midsection or belly button level, just up and ready to fight. You know what I mean? But when your hands are down low like this, all it takes is just a quick jam from this DB and you're done. Now, I would say the more important side of this that got him jammed was the fact that he had this insanely wide base. So guys, we never want to be extended with my back leg and my stance because to get off the ball, like let's say this DB was just in zone coverage and he was off and we had to go run like a quick post or something like that, he would not be able to explode and just shoot his left leg off the ball into the first step of his release. He would either have to take a step and then get off the ball, or he'd have to like dip down to be able to bend this back leg, but it would be a false step. It would be wasted movement. So this DB knows that. He knows that when we are super wide like this, you're not going to be able to have any balance. Guys, so you're going to have to take an extra step, and that extra step is where that DB can get hands. So if we have low hands, wide base, we're ultimately screwing ourselves over off the line of scrimmage, and that's why this wide receiver got jammed. So if you guys said that, that would be 100% correct. So let's look at this example of this wide receiver here. His hands fairly low, but I would say they're a little bit higher. They're not like down below his knees. So I would say this is probably a perfect position. If I was coaching up a receiver, I would probably say to have them just a touch higher than this wide receiver has. But let's pay attention to his base, right? You see how he's got a slight bend to his back leg. Both of his feet are inside of his frame. He doesn't have this super wide stance. So when this DB jams us, he's not screwed. He's not completely off balance. He's not going to get caught on his back leg because his feet are inside his frame. So guys, when we're facing this physical type DB, make sure we're not super wide. My hands aren't super low. My hands aren't X'd on my knee. I can't stand when wide receivers do that. We just want to be in a good base, a good stance. A good stance that I recommend for guys is try to be like 90-90. 90 degrees with your front leg and then 90 degrees with your back leg. And I think that's a good gauge. You just never want to be crazy wide. You never want to be standing straight up, and don't get caught with those hands below your knees.